In this video, we're going to talk about checks for understanding. We're going to start off by quickly talking about what is a check for understanding, just as a reminder. Then we're going to look at the difference between a check for understanding and a self-report. And then most importantly, we're going to look at some ways you can use checks for understanding in a virtual environment. So to start off with, just to remind all of us, a check for understanding is kind of like a mini formative assessment that you as the teacher would use to track the progress of students on how they're doing on mastering the learning objectives you have set for them. The info that you gather from a check for understanding can help guide you as the teacher on how to move forward with both whole group and small group. Use check for understanding as a way to engage all student brains as often as possible. As you use check for understanding in your classroom, you will begin to create a culture of thinking in your class where brains are engaged and ready to answer cold calls or any other checks for understanding that you throw in throughout the lesson. As a rule of thumb or a tip, think of using checks for understanding early and often.
So let's look at what the difference between a check for understanding and a self-report is. When we think of a thumbs up and a thumbs down, we might think of that as a check for understanding, but that's really a self-report. Checks for understanding give us a deeper insight into what a student's thought process is. So something like an open-ended exit ticket would be more of a check for understanding. The key to a check for understanding is to gauge as many thinkers as possible about the topic you're teaching. You can see here there are some examples of what self-report is and what a check for understanding is. Now I want to look a little bit about what gradual release for responsibility is and what you're already doing in your classroom and how checks for understanding can fit into that. A check for understanding should occur frequently as a means to drive students through the gradual release model. In the I do piece of gradual release, students obtain new learning. In the we do piece of gradual release, students develop learning. And in the you do piece of gradual release, students apply learning. You're already doing a lot of these examples here on this slide. We're going to move into now showing you how what you're already doing will fit into check for understanding examples.
So let's first take a look at some of the things that you're already doing for the I do section. You might be using Google Meet and a live Google Meet because they're all live. You can use the polls and the Q&A feature within that if you're using those intentionally and thinking through the questions that you're going to use beforehand. Although sometimes it is good to ask questions on the fly depending on how the conversation is going. You can also use Jamboard. Consider using the sticky notes on that. If you're sending out YouTube videos or you're recording videos using Screencastify, consider using Edpuzzle for that. When you use Edpuzzle, you can insert questions throughout the video that students have to answer to be able to move on. This would be a great way to check how they're doing on that. If you're assigning a reading for an I do before class, consider using Kami or Google Docs or Slides to put the reading into, and then you can embed questions in there that students have to use the commenting feature on to kind of give their feedback or answer questions.
So let's look a little bit at some of these examples. We've talked a little bit about what you can do, but we know that it's helpful to see these in real life. So right here we have an example of an I do video in Edpuzzle, and I'm going to just take a minute to show you. We're not going to play it, but this is a Screencastify video that was recorded by a teacher, and they've put it into Kami, and students are answering questions in here, and they have embedded questions right here into Edpuzzle. So the Screencastify video went into Edpuzzle, and the teacher has embedded some questions. Another example that we have put in here is this Newsella article, and the Newsella article was pulled into Kami, and the teacher added some questions ahead of time for the students to answer. So we're going to go ahead up here and show you what that looks like. And again, we're not going to read through the whole thing, but you can see that there are some questions here that some directions up at the top, and then questions that the teacher embedded throughout the article. Students can answer those questions via text comment right here, or via voice comment or video comment, even if they want to. So this is just another way that you can embed these little checks for understanding and things that you're already doing. We're going to go back here and we're going to move on down to the we do portion of your lesson. And again, things that you're already doing, maybe you're doing a Jamboard and you want to consider using this as a collaborative tool for some small group work, or you're doing a shared writing in Kami or in Google Docs, and you want to have students leave little comments or fill in tables to fill in their answers. You can also use Pear Deck to add some deeper level questions into your already made presentations. You can use Teacher Paste for that. Or whiteboard.chat. This is a fairly new feature, a fairly new tool that we've shared with you. And you can check in on students' whiteboard as a whole group or individually. So you can see the whole class at a glance, or you can see and go into individual students' work and comment on them.
So if we take a look at some of the examples here, this first one right here is kind of a grid view that you would get if you're using whiteboard.chat. Each one of these little purple boxes would be what each different student is doing. So you as the teacher could pull up the grid view, quickly look through to see progress on students, and kind of get a glance as a whole of how your class is doing. This one over here with the big question mark here is an example of using Pear Deck and using the question feature in there. So if I pull up my template here, this is just a Google slide that I did, and then I use the Pear Deck add-on, and I use the multiple choice option. So I ask the question here, I can type in my different options that I want, and students can quickly choose that as we go through. I would probably use this with Pear Deck and using the Teacher Paste mode as a means to keep the lesson moving as we go. This next one down here option is just a simple Jamboard, and I have added this image as a template on top, and I would have small groups. I would assign different Jamboards to different small groups and have them work together to label the layers of the earth here. Then that way I could look back at only just a few of these Jamboards instead of one for each student, but I could see how small groups are doing and decide by small group how I need to progress through gradual release. Final example here we have here is a Google Doc, and it's just a simple table that we've added in, and you can see that they would say student name here, and they would answer the question. This question we posted kind of up here in the top. Students would type their name in and give their answer. Once again, as the teacher, I can look at this one doc, see how students are answering it, look individually students, or think of it more as a whole group and see how they're doing there. So that's how we can kind of do some examples with the We Do. If we move here onto the You Do section, so the section where students apply learning, of course, a lot of the times in You Do with the gradual release, this would be assignments and projects. But there are some times at the end of a lesson where we don't necessarily assign things, but we do want to check in on how students are doing. You can think of using Google Forms as an exit ticket. There's a template made, which we'll show in the examples. In Google Classroom, they have discussions or what's called questions that you can post a question and have students respond there as kind of like an exit ticket. You can use Pear Deck once again, but maybe in this one you use the student paste. So the students work on their own, but you can still build in those exit ticket type things and see. And then of course you can always use Flipgrid as a You Do, where the students would respond to a question or reflect on learning by recording a quick video on that.
So here are some of those examples that Tyler talked about. Right here, you've got an example of a question in Google Classroom. This is the question feature that not many people use, but you can post a question and students can answer. Over here, we've got an example of a Google Form exit ticket, and I just want to show you here, I'm on the Google Form homepage, and if we go up here to this template gallery up here, you've got an exit ticket template. So you've got one already made for you. If you click on it, then you can go to this template and you can customize it however you would like. So I'm going to go back over here. We've got a Flipgrid response here, and it's just an example of many Flipgrid templates that are available in the Discovery Library. I believe this is one that Tyler made for his class. And then over here is an example of the Pear Deck grid view of student work. So this is the actual teacher dashboard, and you can quickly comment on student work. You can see all of their work at a glance. But this is a great way for students to show you what they're learning. All of these ideas are just examples of things that you can do. There's many other ways that you can embed checks for understanding into what you're already doing. We've given you kind of a lot of examples, but we haven't really told you how to do any of those. If you are interested in learning more about how to do some of these things, if you look off to the left here on our website, under this digital tool guide, there are many how-to videos, so you can see how to do a lot of these things that we've talked about today, whether it's in Kami or Pear Deck or Flipgrid or anything like that. There's lots of how-to videos for you. So what's next? What do you do with all of this information? You've got your lesson and you've collected all this information from kids. You're really just trying to get feedback from them so that you know where to go next. The whole point of a check for understanding is to inform you on where to go next in the gradual release process. Maybe you're finding that after you gather this data, then you find that students aren't ready for the next step in the process. Maybe you need to go back and maybe you need to remodel the skill for your students. Maybe you need to pull a small group of students and you need to work with them on a specific skill that they're struggling with. Or maybe you just need to work with a couple of individual students. Maybe you need to slow down a little bit and scaffold the concepts that you're teaching them. Maybe you need to increase your pacing, or maybe you need to just differentiate a little bit more. All of these checks for understanding are helping you to pace your class and to move your lesson along, but they need to happen frequently, and the most important part is what you do with this information.
To round this out, we just have some additional resources for you down here at the bottom. Some are from the IDOE, some are just exit ticket templates that we found, and other ideas that we find. Also, think about using some of the game type things that you're already using with your class. Some of these, like Kahoot, Quizlet, and Quizzes, have some good data in it that you can use as a whole group. So of course, as you play Kahoot, you'll have like graphs and things that show how your kids are doing on different questions. Quizlet, kind of the same thing, and Quizzes has some of those things too. So though they're a little more informal on how they show up and how you use them in your classroom, using some of those as formative assessments is good as well. As always, if you have any questions on how to set any of these digital tools up, please feel free to reach out to Kelly or I. We are here to help.